The next speaker is Make Mothers Matter.
The reality is that all over the world, there is a huge majority of women caring for theirs or for others' children, for the elderly, and all dependents. Women care for their family, and that's a beautiful and indispensable work. Women themselves sometimes do not know how much this specificity of motherhood and its unremarkable everyday life is in fact remarkable, fundamental to our future. It has a huge economic value. It has a huge impact on development, and it makes all these women actors of development and change makers.
Let's dare to utter the word mother and expand its meaning beyond kitchen and diapers. By using the word with pride, we will show all mothers who they really are and what they really do. They might have no salary for what they do for their children and little recognition, but without them, the world has no future. Care is a treasure. Caring for each other is not only necessary, it is also the one thing that makes us happy. Care is a resource. It is indispensable to support the world's economies. And care is an investment. As I said, care is crucial for a child's development. It is an investment in a child's future and therefore in our society's future. Care is indeed work. Unpaid family care work might be very hard, particularly in developing countries because of the lack of services and infrastructures, particularly also for single mothers. But it is still the most important thing there is to do, the most important work, and someone has to do it. We have to acknowledge that it's mostly mothers who do it. Mothers who fetch wood and water for their families. Mothers who take leaves to care for their children, and this was exacerbated during COVID. Mothers who take part-time jobs or temporarily leave from the labor market for childcare purposes. What kind of world do we live in when the treasure of care is counted for nothing unless it is externalized and enters the GDP? The injustice of all of this on mothers cannot be tackled if unpaid family care work is not visible.
What we want at Make Mothers Matter is for the world to be aware of how much mothers matter.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to all of you, to our distinguished panelists, to all our participants, to our interpreters, because this webinar will be in English, but there will be French interpretation all along, and you only have to click the interpretation button to follow it in French. There is also a Q&A button for question and answers, and please, if you need it, specify to whom you would like to address your question. And there is also a chat box. If you need anything, don't hesitate to communicate with us through the chat box. Well, why does Make Mothers Matter organize an event, a side event of the UN High-Level Political Forum on changing the narrative about unpaid care work and the economy? Well, because a lot of the unpaid care work is done by women and mostly mothers within their family. Because as it was said in the video, Although unpaid care work is a treasure, a necessity, a resource, an investment, it is yet a source of great injustice and poverty for those who carry it out, mostly women, mothers also. And we organize this event because we strongly believe that changing the narrative is the first step to bring about change. So let's now begin and welcome Olivier De Schutter, UN Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights. You will find his bio on our website, as well as all the speakers' bio. So for now, Olivier, let me just tell you our deepest gratitude, not only for being here with us today, but because you are a change maker, fighting for the eradication of poverty. And poverty is a word that covers so many individual lives to which we cannot be indifferent. And among those individuals, there are too many mothers and therefore too many children, and which is why your presence here with us is really important. Olivier, thank you for introducing this webinar. Please, could you put your sound on?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Angler de Liedekerke, for inviting me to contribute to this very important discussion on indeed a topic that is absolutely crucial, although perhaps insufficiently paid attention to in discussions around how to combat poverty and reduce inequalities. I would like, in the 6-7 minutes I have, to try to answer 3 questions. And the first one is, why is this discussion so timely as it is convened today? And here I would like to highlight the fact that the COVID-19 pandemic has led to questioning our usual assessment of what work means and of what work matters. I believe a new valuation of work has now entered into the public discussion. We move from the idea that the market should determine the value of work and set the rewards, even though some jobs contribute very little to the common good or even have negative externalities for society, to the idea that some types of work have immense positive externalities that deserve to be better recognized, acknowledged, and indeed rewarded. We found that many jobs are essential to society's good functioning and deserve to be protected and rewarded because of the huge contribution they make to child development, to the ability for the economy to be resilient against economic shocks, and to build human capital. This is the case for workers in the food chains, for workers in the care and health sectors, in the welfare system. It is, of course, also the case for the unpaid and often unrecognized work performed within the household. The chores of cleaning, of buying food and of cooking, childcare, the care of the sick and the elderly have been historically undervalued because largely performed by women without remuneration, and it is still largely performed by women and by mothers in particular because it is unremunerated. And historically, that is why this has been undervalued. There was a gender pay gap that still is very important in many countries. There is gender segregation in employment, and therefore the opportunity costs for women to perform unremunerated care work within the family were lower, and so they were, as a result, mostly performing those unrecognized duties. So I think the COVID-19 pandemic is really an opportunity to build this new narrative. The second question I'd like to ask is, how can we manage to recognize the burdens women shoulder and acknowledge them without reinforcing gender stereotypes? Now, we know how important unpaid care work is to the economy and to general welfare. Calculated in GDP equivalent, it would be equivalent to 15% of the GDP in countries such as Korea or South Africa, 63% of the GDP in countries such as India or Tanzania, if what women do within households were to be paid at market price. And this is without even taking into account what, Anne-Claire, you mentioned, which are the very important positive externalities from this work, as documented, for example, in her book, The Price of Motherhood by Anne Crittenden. So how to acknowledge this work without reinforcing gender stereotypes is, I think, an important question when we study issues such as the family wage or the opportunity of introducing universal basic income. And here I have to say, in my own work, I've been guided by the framework proposed by Diane Elson and built upon by Rosalind Eben and Marzia Fontana, that show the need to combine recognition with reduction of the burden and with redistribution of roles. Recognition because we must recognize the importance of women's unpaid contribution, of course, but we must also work to reduce that burden that, as a result, they shoulder by developing social services, public services that can ease the situation for these women. Piped water, clean electricity, energy for households, childcare services, of course, especially in rural areas, are absolutely vital. And the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women in Article 11, paragraph 2, refers to the need to provide necessary supporting social services to enable parents to combine family obligations with work responsibilities and participation in public life. So recognition is important. Reduction of burden is equally vital. And this is what, in a paper of 2007, Shahra Razavi had mentioned for the United Nations Social Research Institute on Social Development in a paper titled The Return to Social Policy and the Persistent Neglect of Unpaid Care. But beyond recognition and reduction, we need a redistribution of roles. We need to provide tools so that the responsibilities are more equally shared between women and men. And in this regard, I think it's really important that men are involved in this conversation and realize that combating gender stereotypes and the existing division of roles between women and men is not only a way to emancipate women and ensure that they are economically empowered and able to train, to seek further education and to access employment opportunities. It's also a way to liberate men from these stereotypes that are imprisoning them, just like they are imprisoning women. And my third and final question is, how can we make sure that social protection on which I work is transformative of gender roles? And here I would say we need, of course, to avoid reinforcing gender stereotypes in social protection schemes. If we look at schemes such as Bolsa Familia in Brazil, or formerly Oportunidades that became Progresa in Mexico, although it was abolished in 2019, or Pandawit Pamilya, the 4Ps scheme in the Philippines. These are cash transfer systems with conditionalities that women have to comply with because it is women that receive the money. And the stereotype is that women are chiefly responsible for the health and education of the children. And I believe it may be problematic, this message that we are sending. We also must ensure, of course, that social protection does not create indirect discrimination. And the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, at the time when I was serving as a member on that committee, adopted the decision in the case Calero versus Ecuador concerning access to old age pension for a woman who had to interrupt her payments to the social security system for a period of 8 months, and therefore was denied old age pension because of that interruption due to the care responsibilities she had to assume at the time. And we found in that decision that this was a discrimination against women, that the social security system was not taking into account the disparate impact on women that this penalization of interrupted careers would lead to. Beyond this, I think social protection can be transformative. We have, for example, examples of public works programs that allow for quotas for women, that allow to acquire qualifications, allowing women to then seek employment opportunities, that allow for childcare facilities to be provided in order to allow women to participate more effectively. And I believe we should think further as to how social protection can be transformative in this sense. So these were the three questions I personally had in mind when entering into this discussion. I very much look forward to listening to the various interventions on this hugely important topic, certainly on the issue of poverty and human rights. Many thanks again.
Many thanks, Olivier, for your introduction. And indeed, the social global fund for social protection that you are working on could be a really powerful tool in the area we're working on right now. So really, thank you. And we could already start a debate on the word burden, because as you say, the burden part needs to be redistributed, but care is so much more than a burden. And that's also an aspect to show fathers and people that care is a wonderful thing to do as well. So thank you for what you're saying, and stay with us for the debate also after. Now I would like to introduce Susan Himmelweit, who is going to be our moderator today. And Sue, you have been working for years on the economics of caring. You have been denouncing how much unpaid care work is at the root of gender inequality. And your deep knowledge of the actual narrative and of what needs to be changed is an asset in order to start the change, and that you've been working on for so long. So thank you for moderating this event, and I give you the floor. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Anne-Claire. This is a wonderful opportunity for us all to get together and talk about such important issues. As you said, I have worked on them for many years, and it's wonderful to see so many people engaged in these issues today. And thank you, Olivier, for your words. They're very, very wise and very good setup for what we're going to talk about. I hope you will agree to join in the panel at the end when we have discussions, because I'm sure a lot of the questions will be relevant to your expertise too. Last year, Make Mothers Matter had a very successful event, and the theme then was placing care and education at the heart of a new economic system, and that's what we're going to continue today. We want to continue and build on that conversation by focusing on one particular aspect of care, which is the unpaid care. And our whole economic system is so dependent on this. And we therefore need to think about both how we change the narrative about unpaid care, but also what sort of economic system could we have that places unpaid care in a much better position in terms of both, as we talked about, the burdens, but also the enabling side of an economic system, that it can enable care to be so much better than it is. And to do that, all the themes from last year's events actually remain relevant. First, the event last year showed that ensuring that our society takes care of all its members should be a collective concern and responsibility. Care is often talked about as very individual, one person giving to another, but that we have a system in which people are cared for is a collective concern and responsibility. Second, a year ago, we were very in the midst of the pandemic, we still are, and what it has shown is how important that care is, how we couldn't have survived the pandemic without it, and how we have always depended on it and will continue to depend on it long after the pandemic is over. Third, we saw how existing care systems showed themselves just not to be ready for the challenge of a pandemic. So that we had care systems in place, but they were not flexible enough or good enough. They hadn't been good enough before the pandemic. They certainly weren't good enough in a pandemic. A fourth, that building a care society, a more caring society, is an investment for us all. It's both sustainable, and it's a very good way of generating jobs and reducing gender inequalities in employment. That's one of the areas that I've done some work on. And as a result, it's really important that care is mainstreamed in all policy making, not just the policy making that thinks that it's about care, but nearly everything has impacts on care, and care has impacts on nearly all other aspects of policy making. So we ought to recognize that care should be mainstreamed in all policy making. The fifth point that came up last year is that we need a well-being metric rather than GDP to measure the costs and benefits of investing in a caring society. And however we measure well-being, we have to make sure that it's a way in which care is at its heart. And for me, that would be central, because caregiving is actually the activity that enables people to do and to be what they couldn't otherwise do or be. And that really is the heart of what well-being means. And finally, and this will come as no surprise to people who registered for this call, that economies depend on their care systems. They run on people being cared for. And at the core of the care system of any economy is the provision of unpaid care. In all countries, even those with the most highly developed systems of paid care, the amount of unpaid care that's given is vastly greater than that provided by paid workers. But the pandemic has also demonstrated to us how unequally unpaid care is divided, and the effects this unequal division has on people's lives. It pervades all inequalities in society and impacts negatively on the experience of both caregiving and care receiving. And in turn, those inequalities in wider society reinforce those divisions in unpaid care, reinforcing the notion that care is just mothers' and women's work. So this year, we're going to concentrate specifically on unpaid care, what underlies the care system and thus the economy, and recognizing that not just for now, but for any conceivable economy we might build, it will depend on and benefit from enabling and encouraging everyone to be able to receive and to give unpaid care. In my vision of a new economy, we would all be citizen carers. This involves turning the usual logic of economists and policymakers on its head. Instead of expecting unpaid care to pick up the pieces that the economy doesn't cope with, we have to change the narrative to recognize the centrality of the contribution of unpaid care, and to think about how the economy can be better structured around it, so that both caregiving and care receiving are better experiences, improving well-being and contributing to a well-being economy. This will involve, as well as recognizing care, redistributing it so that everyone plays a part in a more caring society, and of course, reducing the burden side of it. But like Anne-Claire, I would think it's very important to concentrate on the positive side of caregiving too. So to explore these issues, we're now going to have two sessions. The first is on how to change the narrative within families, within workplaces, and the community more generally on unpaid care work. The second session will be on the equally important question of how we change the narrative on the economy to recognize the central role of unpaid care. And that means changing the economy. Given that women, and particularly mothers, do the bulk of unpaid care, and it's women who've thought more about how to change it, it may therefore seem slightly strange that our first speaker is a man. But the solution to redistribution will have to involve big changes for men and fathers, as will the changes that we want to make to the economy anyway. So we're very lucky to have Gary Barker, the founder and CEO of Promundo Global, which is a global consortium of NGOs working in more than 50 countries to end violence against women and girls, and promote men's involvement as equal non-violent caregivers. And he's going to talk to us, among other things, about the potential multiplier effect of sharing unpaid care can have on the well-being of every family member, on gender equality, and on a more caring society. Over to you, Gary.
Thanks, Susan, and thanks, Olivier, for your and Anne-Claire for your opening comments, and thanks for including me in this conversation. And I think I will step in exactly where the two of you ended, which is how do we focus on the redistribution? I'll just use one slide there because I know that time is quite short. We have, as part of a global campaign, Men Care, tried to push the social imagination of believing not only can we move toward equality, but we must achieve equality in terms of men and boys' participation in care work. We know that globally women do about 3 times of the daily care of our homes. And we know that at the current rate of change, based on our calculations of the countries where we have good time use data, we're about 92 years from equality. That is, men are slowly doing more of this, as we're in Europe, about 30% of households say they've achieved something close to equality in care work at home. Other parts of the world, based on data from UN Women, it looks to be somewhere between 10 and 15% of households where women say a male partner is doing an equal share of the care work at home. So we still have a huge gap to achieve equality. We think COVID has been both, it is of course a crisis. Women have been 1.8 times the out of work population during COVID. The burden on women is clear as well. From UN data, women are doing about 5.2 hours more per week of care work than they did before COVID. And here's where we see the hope in COVID, which is that men say they're doing about 3.5 hours more care work per week. Now this comes on top of inequality. So it was already like this and now it's moved up like this. But the point is we've had a global situation where men in some ways are kind of on an enforced obligatory paternity leave for these months of lockdowns in many countries. And I think and believe, and we as a network of organizations trying to promote this equality, think there's a moment to kind of seize and promote the kind of policies that we need to achieve the change in this distribution of care work. So we have put out since 2015, every 2 years, we do a State of the World's Fathers report, looking at the gaps of what we need to do to achieve equality in care work. This year, we proposed 7 structural solutions, and I'll go through them quickly because I know we want to offer time for some reflections. One is we need good national policies. And I think, Susan, you touched on this. Often our policies around, actually, if you'll skip ahead a couple of slides. One more, keep going there. I'm into the 7 recommendations given our time here. One more there. There we go. Is to have national policies. So it's the action 1 that I'm referring to. As I think the both of you have alluded to, our policies on care work have often been piecemeal. We may have leave policies and then later we may fix pension plans. We may build support for childcare and other supports for working parents, but they tend to be in most countries quite piecemeal and one-off. We think Uruguay offers an example of putting them all in one package, and still to be seen its impact over the long haul, but it does seem to be an example for how countries can get it together in terms of putting in one funded and resourced national policy, what a care policy can look like that includes goals about redistribution. So offer that as one example. Next slide, please. Action 2, fairly obvious. It's one of those that we've got the most data around, is equitable parental leave. We've made advances on that in the EU. Many countries have increased leave in the past years. During COVID, there's been an increased leave in some countries. We think the leave needs to be increased and that we need non-transferable leave for fathers. Now, obviously, leave works if you have a job. Other mechanisms are necessary if you're out of the paid workforce. But we do think if we look globally across, and I won't go through these, but it's in the report, of the countries that offer paid maternity and paternity leave, the global average number of days available for women is 98, while the average number of days or median number of days for men is 5. Now, we do not advocate reducing the number of days for women. What we believe is the need to push and increase the number of days for men. And we think the multiplier effects there are quite clear. We've got data from the Scandinavian countries and elsewhere that adding those days along with doing the social norm change so that men feel obligated and nudged to actually take the leave is key. Next one, please. Actually, skip ahead to action 3, if you would. Action 3, I think, connects up very much with something that Olivier said before, is the importance of building on existing social protection programs. Olivier mentioned Bolsa Familia, there's Familias en Acción in Colombia, there's many that reach up to 1 in 4, 1 in 5 households in some countries. They are, for the most part, giving money to mothers as we believe in the efficiency of that and the importance of that. But women themselves tell us that without redistribution of care at home, women are not able to either enter the paid workforce or often to use the wraparound services that are often included as part of such social protection programs. We did a review 2 years back of about 150 plus cash transfer programs. The vast majority did nothing to nudge men's participation in care work. We found 4 that did, that had something about increasing men's care work. We've collaborated in Brazil with Bolsa Familia of doing so, and found the importance and the multiplier effect if we do that. So again, the need to push the imagination on existing and functioning working social protection programs to promote men's participation, equitable participation as care workers. Number 4, if you pass to the next one, please, is the health sector. We know that as the point of entry for maternal and child health care, it's a key area to make normal men's participation from early moments on. We've done work with health sectors in a number of countries of how to think about this. Some cases that's parent training that includes men, and we've measured results in Rwanda of reductions in household violence, increases in men's participation in care work, increases in women's attending antenatal visits, as well as increases in men's care work in the home when done well. And we're working with the Ministry of Health in Rwanda to take that program to scale. In other countries, it's about changing the protocols of visits, of prenatal visits and other services, but we think that's a key one as well, and provide some highlights for things that can work. Action 5. One more, if you'll just skip to the next one, is the social norms that we've been talking about. How do we start early? This is not just about engaging adult men when they're in a partnered relationship. We know from UNICEF data that girls do 3.5 times the amount of care work when they're children, when they're young, compared to their brothers. So we've got to start early with messaging and cultural messaging, television, media, in what we include in the school curriculum, ways to make care work normal and seen as something that boys and men must do. There's some creative national campaigns, the Republic of Georgia, supported by the UN, by UN Women and UNFPA, and where we have seen some evidence of actually changes in norms as the result of a concentrated ongoing campaign involving the government, UN, private sector. Next one, please.
Gary, you have just 1 minute left.
All right, I'm getting there. 7 is my last one. 6 is a fairly obvious one, building on the decent work platform that ILO has come out with, and making, and I think your language, Susan, about citizen carers, acknowledging all of our places that we've got work and care duties as well, building that into what workplaces do. Of course, giving that teeth by having national legislation that ensures it. So it's not just parental leave, but it's also the support that we need in ongoing, I hear the bell going off, but the ongoing support we need in our care duties. And finally, action 7, and I will end here, is political will. It has been courageous women and feminists who have led this platform for years. Make Mothers Matter has been among those of making it visible at the policy level. But we as a network, and I personally believe that men need to have a stake in care work. Olivier hinted at the importance of us having a stake in it, doing it at home, and we believe that's important too. But I want male politicians to feel accountable for the care economy, to feel that they have to hold up care. Women have been doing the work at home and carrying the flag in politics. I don't want to let men off the hook for that. And I will end on that, that I want to see men accountable for care policies as much as women politicians. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gary. That's a great speech, great talk. We're now equally fortunate to have Sonia Malaspina, who is the Human Resources Director at Danone in Italy, and where she introduced its caregiver policy. She's also a lifelong feminist activist who has always supported the inclusion of diversity in the workplace as a lever to create economic and social value. And I think she's going to talk about how supporting workers with caregiving responsibilities, especially mothers, can be a win-win strategy for both employers and employees. Over to you, Sonia.
Thank you, Susan. Dear friends, it's a pleasure for me to be part of this so important collective reflection on the value of care. I will tell you about our experience. It's a 10-year journey. We're still in the journey. But a reflection about 1 year and a half of a health emergency is that care is more important than ever, not only in our families, in the society, but in the companies. The companies have to realize that they have a role to play. And I tell you about an experience in Danone. The magnitude of Danone in Italy is 500 Danoners, so 500 people with their family. We are certified B Corp, that for me is something important to say, because in doing our business, we care for the people, we care for the planet. So we try to do an important contradictory thing so far, but we think that we can manage. It's a struggle, but we can manage. And so building about a more inclusive and sustainable economy. If you go one slide, the experience is about putting the care at the center. When I started working more than 20 years ago, the word maternity was not even spoken, pronounced in a workplace. It was a taboo. Life, maternity did not exist. The company, to be in a company, you should be perfect. And all the care part, all the life part have been to deny or put apart. So there was a negative connotation. I lived on my skin, this, not just treatment. So I spent my 10 years in studying, applying practices to support mother and then also father in the workplace. And this is done with the basic rule. I can share with you, they are published, okay? So they are about economical support, of course. They are also about organizational support, cultural support, and most important, psycho-emotional support. Because the most important thing that a mom wants to listen when she's back in the workplace is that the employer cares for her. She's not penalized because she has chosen maternity, but she has a value for the company, her coming back. And in my country, 1 of 3 women quit the job after the maternity because there is a negative connotation around maternity in the workplace. So this rule, and I meet all the moms coming back from maternity in these 10 years. So it is very important to listen and to connect. For example, I share it with you, moms during the pandemic are alone. They are alone when they have a child in the hospital. There is not the partner, not the family. So when they are coming back in the workplace, they need more than before the support of the company. Here you can see that my policy has become global, so the company has applied to all the owners in the world by 2020. But I want to go through a very nice thing, that is the learning that we have from maternity coming back. We have measured competencies of mom before and after the maternity. And I will show you in a minute, if you go in the journey, if you stay in the journey, Valerie, for me it's important. Then maternity policy, parental policy, has opened the door to other policy, for example, LGBT, caregiver policy, anti-harassment and discrimination policy. The policy shape the culture of a company. And it is important also, in this year, we are sharing the policy and the results of the application with our customers and with our suppliers. Okay, so second slide, just to tell you, it's very relevant in my country. I have huge mediatic coverage. The women in my country are really in a desperate need of help, okay? For many reasons, the distribution of care is not equal. And I'm working with the family ministry in Italy to improve the legislation. Then if we go again with the learning, this is the policy in Italy that I will send you in English. If you go next, this is the work done with the family ministry. The company can influence policy maker because they can show the results of the application of the family. So just an example of the improvement of our legislation, paternity paid leave from 1 day to 10 days, because we applied, they have seen the value of a better redistribution of the roles. Then I wanted to share with you the results of having studied what I was telling you before, so you go next. Having studied the maternity. Maternity is a master. So what I was observing in this year, I see moms coming back that were more productive, more able, more organized. So it was my observation. So I asked some research center to study competencies before and after the maternity leave. And we have discovered amazing results. The competencies that are crucial for a company are increasing a lot, not only for women, but also for men that take the parental leave. And also for caregivers. So not only caring for a child, but also caring for an elderly person. And in the next slide, I show you the results that for me are crucial. Our parents declare that the soft skills have improved. So they feel more able to put things together. They are more engaged. But I'm looking at this as an employer. Okay, so if I support maternity and paternity, it's a cost, okay? But I have a return on the investment because, as you can see, the crucial competencies of this digital world are increasing a lot, between 20 and 35%. So I have better professional back. Of course, I have to think with a medium long-term view, because if I just consider short-term, it will happen as I have experienced. Moms do not have to work because they are away from the work for some months. But if a company facilitate the mom coming back, has an incredible return on the investment. And so the application of the KPIs of this policy in 10 years give us, in the next slide, excellent KPIs.
You have just 1 minute left.
I know. Excellent KPIs. Then 100% of mom comes back to work after the maternity. We have a positive natality rate in a country in which natality rate is decreasing. We have women that are growing as managers, 64%, women that are promoted, and very important, on all the promotion that we made, 20% goes to mom coming back from the maternity leave. Of course, our dads are taking the paternity days, but more than this, absenteeism is equal to 0, engagement rate of the people is very high, 85% of the mom declare that they can breastfeed. So these are economical metrics. So I discuss with the management, the top management, showing these. And now my management is convinced about the value of the maternity. And the value is an economical, not just a social value. And then, sorry, we go to the next. More than ever, we have to be close to listen to our people. And in my view, as a company, we have a role to play, influencing institution, policymaker with these KPIs, because we show that there is an economical benefit. And of course, continue to fight internally. For every maternity coming back, it's a fight. But I think, and I demonstrate, that is worth having this approach. And so I leave you with my contact detail, and I'm here to answer the question that you may have.
Thank you very much. That was really interesting. We're now going to move on to the second part of our discussion. The two parts are so closely connected, it's almost hard to say that they really are two different parts. But we're going to focus a bit more on changing the narrative on the economy. So we're thinking about how do we empower mothers, parents, families by changing the narrative on the economy, because we don't only need to see how to change how unpaid care is seen in families and workplaces, but we need to use that change and in fact to fundamentally restructure the economy. I wanted to say that you will have a chance to ask Gary and Sonia questions at the end. So think of them now, write them down, and then listen to our next two speakers. Our first one is Anna Parvez, who is the Gender Justice Research Lead from Oxfam, Great Britain, where she co-authored two of their flagship inequality reports that you can see by their name are very relevant to what we're talking about: Public Good or Private Wealth and Time to Care. She will talk about how we can build on that good work and that of feminists more generally to try to change views on unpaid care work so that the economy works better for women. And it's yours now. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Sue. Olivier, Make Mothers Matter. Good morning, afternoon, evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to be a part of such an important discussion. So at Oxfam, we focused on shifting a few key narratives on care and economic inequality through our Women's Economic Empowerment and Care program, our global campaigns, working very closely with feminist economists and activists from both the global South and North. And these are really narratives and norms that exist in the social sphere, but also within institutions, influencing important policy and investment decisions. So why narratives? Our research shows that technology and public services alone don't shift women's workloads. It's the combination of these investments and narrative norm change that really leads to sustainable changes in women's lives, and particularly so for racialized groups and non-citizens who are crowded into care jobs and considered unskilled, expendable workers. So I'll talk quickly about which narratives need to change, how they manifest in low-income contexts, and what is work to shift them. So which narratives, and the first, and Gary, Olivier, and others have spoken about this, are really gendered narratives stemming from patriarchal norms that care is a woman's natural role and duty. A particularly effective strategy that we found working in rural areas in 8 low-income countries has really been mentoring couples and working with male care champions in households, parliaments, among cultural and religious leaders. And by sharing care and domestic tasks, they then provide positive examples that challenge existing perceptions of masculinity, but also behavior that is considered normal. And so this begins with small and easy actions at first, men's cooking and laundry competitions, We've also found that safe spaces for women and men to discuss gender roles is also really important, as oftentimes, women do consider care to be their role, their identity and source of pride, and are uncertain about sharing care work. And so these approaches have really laid the groundwork for more profound changes in narratives, framing care as a collective responsibility. Next, please. So beyond gender norms, we need to shift narratives about work and the economy itself. What is considered work versus leisure, skilled versus unskilled? For instance, care work is considered helping, care jobs considered less important to the economy than finance jobs. And this matters. Where cooking, elder care are perceived as leisure activities, this work is then not counted in labor force surveys, economic analysis, measures of progress. It's not invested in. Even when it's paid, it's not protected by labor legislation on hours and wages. We conducted a survey asking community respondents to rank common activities by value and skill. And all respondents, men and women, ranked people care as being low skill as compared to tending farm animals. So what have we found to work then? Participatory research tools such as rapid care analysis, which includes a time use exercise, can help men and women better understand the time, effort, and difficulty of care work. In Zimbabwe, access to time and labor saving equipment has actually helped nudge shifts in perceptions of domestic work being unskilled. In our communications, turning existing narratives on their heads. So not saying women are out of the labor force, but instead saying men are under participating in the labor force in unpaid labor. And then calculating a monetary value, 10.8 trillion has helped make visible the enormous economic importance of unpaid care. And when juxtaposed with other sectors of the economy, which are considered to be worth more, such as the IT sector, it's helped us upend some of those existing norms. And of course, many actors have contributed to this work. The 19th International Conference of Labor Statisticians in 2013 saw the adoption of a definition of work that is now more inclusive of all forms of work, both paid and unpaid. Next, please. So 10 years ago, very often care was considered a private matter, a woman's issue in development circles, but now officials increasingly recognize it as a public policy issue. And I think, and you'll all agree, we owe a lot to the work of feminist economists and activists, the UN Special Rapporteur of Extreme Poverty and Human Rights, who in 2013 demonstrated in a report that heavy and unequal care work was a violation of human rights. And of course, the global momentum that is being created by the SDGs inclusion of Target 5.4 to recognize and value unpaid care. So what have we found to work in low-income countries? Local level evidence demonstrating the problem, its impact on the wider society, and a focus on solutions. So our research showed how access to an improved water source can decrease women's time on unpaid care work in Zimbabwe by 4 hours a day. And evidence like this has led to 28 local government units in the Philippines adopting new laws that make it mandatory to address unpaid care in all planning and budgeting processes. We've also, especially so in the past few years, tried to better connect narratives on care, economic inequality, and poverty, really showing how the extractive economic system widens economic and care inequalities, trapping women in cycles of income and time poverty. And these narratives have helped us reach audiences beyond women's rights spaces. Next, please. So this goes back to the very initial kind of discussion in the chat, but we try to avoid using the term burden when advocating on care, because burden implies that something only needs to be reduced and minimized. Yes, for many women, providing care for their family is grueling. We want absolutely a reduction in the difficulty and arduousness of domestic tasks, as Shara has also said, such as fetching water and firewood. However, we don't want a reduction in care itself. A review we conducted in 2016 of economic narratives in international financial institution policies and strategies revealed that care was only mentioned as a constraint to women's labor force participation, something to be reduced to allow for economic growth, not invested in for economic development. So by reframing it instead as a social good, we can help people to see that care is critical to social and economic well-being. We invest in social goods. We want families to spend more on care equipment and governments to invest more in care services. And key to reframing the narrative from burden to benefit has been showing the impact of care on well-being outcomes, on the health of caregivers, paid labor force participation, relationships. I'm coming on to my last slide, and apologies if I'm talking too fast. I'm trying to get through this. And then, so where do we go from here? For sustainable positive change, we really need to work with, and Gary has also stressed this, unexpected allies, ad agencies, religious leaders, corporations who all influence our mindsets. We need to invest in narrative shifts as a strategy at both the community, but also the institutional level. And I haven't had enough time to mention this, but we need to connect with climate, racial justice, and economic justice movements. And my very last point is that where narrative shifts are happening, offering practical context-specific solutions. Many organizations have collaborated on a care policy scorecard to provide civil society organizations with a practical tool to monitor government performance on care policies, which will be launched later this year in September. So thank you very much. I look forward to hearing Shara's presentation as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anam. That was really, really interesting, and going into actually how we do something about those narratives. Now, finally, we have my good friend Shara Azavi. I'm so pleased that she's here to talk to you, and I think you will be too once you've heard her. She's the Director of Social Protection at the International Labour Organization, the ILO. Shara is a feminist economist who's worked and made a difference for women, I think, in all the key international organizations, including UN Women and United Nations Research Institute for Social Development. And she's going to talk about, among other things, how adequate social protection is key to supporting unpaid caregivers. And in particular, a theme close to my heart, how to change the narrative on it so that it's considered a long-term investment in our future instead of an expense to be minimized. Thank you, Shara.
Thank you, Sue, for that very nice and generous introduction. And it's a real pleasure to be here. So I really want to thank Making Mothers Matter and everyone who's been involved for extending the invitation. I am afraid, Adam, I don't have a presentation. I'm just going to try and answer the questions that I was sent. And I think it's good coming in last, because having heard what everyone says, I think I can be very brief on some points and maybe elaborate a bit more on other issues that perhaps have not been sufficiently highlighted. I think the issue to start with, I mean, this one of the questions I was asked is, this ILO's definition of work that now includes unpaid care work, and what is it going to take for this recognition to concretely kind of change people's lives. It said women's lives, but I think we mean everyone's lives, right? I think the issue of measurement and visibility in terms of data, I think that is critical. I think there's this nice saying about measuring what you treasure, and for too long we have not been measuring a lot of really valuable work that people do, the unpaid care work that we've been talking about. And I just want to echo what was just said about the 19th International Conference of Labour Statisticians, which is not normally a forum you would associate with having a revolution, but they did have a little mini revolution in 2013 because they conceptually changed the definition of work in a way that includes the goods and services that are being produced for others in the household, as well as for one's own use. And this introduction of the phrase services for use by others and for own use did mark a very decisive change, as it recognized that as work, the production of services provided in the home for other household members, as well as for one's own personal use. This was, I think, quite important in terms of how we will continue to measure work. We know that this definition and the fact that unpaid care work is still not included in the system of national accounts, which is what produces the GDP measures of the economy that all countries produce. This means that even though unpaid care work is now recognized as work by labor statisticians, it's still not included in calculations of GDP. Of course, we have satellite accounts that try to measure unpaid care work and show that if that was included, what percentage of GDP in different countries it would constitute. I think that work of having those satellite accounts is important. But the ILO definition of work has not gone its full way, I think, in making the measurements of the economy include unpaid care work. But what it has done is that the ILO also in 2018, the International Labour Conference provided a new international classification of status of work, which covers all jobs and all work activities, which includes own use provision of services. And that means that in the near future, unpaid care work will be regarded as a status of work, and statistics on unpaid care work will be collected more frequently through labor force and household surveys, and not just what we now have, which are time use surveys. So I think this International Conference of Labour Statisticians has done quite important work in expanding the boundaries of work beyond pure market transactions and recognizing unpaid care work as work, and opening the door to a future where unpaid care might be included in also calculations of GDP. But how does that all this recognition and visibility in data obviously is very important, but I think we really need to be thinking about also policies. You know, we cannot wait for the data to be available and for GDP to come up with new measures that includes unpaid care work. There are other things that happen in parallel that make a big difference in people's lives. And here I really want to highlight 2 points. One is supporting unpaid care work through investments in care services. And this goes to the point that you made, Sue, about the importance of collective responsibility, because these investments in care services are something that we all contribute to and pay for through taxation and so forth. And it's very important in redistributing some of the work that is currently done, predominantly by women, but also by some men, within households and families, and making sure that that work is not reduced, but it's redistributed, and that care services assume a certain responsibility for this. And here, I think care services are important, but also we need to be thinking about, as we, as you all know, specific services, person-to-person care services, child care services, long-term care services. And here, I think the critical issue is how these services are financed and provided. Are they widely available, accessible, affordable, and do they meet good quality standards? I think these are the really key questions. And having these kind of services available is not only a good strategy for employment generation, as Sue, you have shown in your studies with Jérôme D'Arnaud, in terms of the potential of the care sector in generating jobs, particularly if they're good quality jobs, but also very important in supporting people who are now currently have a lot of responsibility in terms of unpaid care provisioning. So it really redistributes the burden and the joy of unpaid care work, if you like, and provides the kind of support from care services. And here I think the issues of quality and affordability, as I said, are really key, which in turn really also we need to raise questions about how care workers are rewarded and the extent to which what we call the care penalty, the fact that care workers often do not receive a wage that is commensurate with the kind of human capital investments that has been made in their training and so forth. There is a care penalty, we know from research on the topic. Here, very importantly, I think it's really important to see how care workers are rewarded. And with this pandemic, there's been a lot of recognition and applause for care workers, but then the question is how this translates into proper remuneration. And here we have some indication of some countries that have increased the compensation, for example, for health workers through allowance allowances and additional remuneration. But we know that within care work, there's also a hierarchy, and the sort of person care, those who work in long-term care institutions, childcare providers, are not often rewarded in the same way that health workers are. So it's really important that this recognition does translate into proper compensation. And also voice for care workers. And secondly, I think it's really important to also—
Shara, you just have 1 more minute.
Okay, sorry. Also to reward unpaid care work that people do through the provision of all kinds of paid leave. So people are not penalized, you know, they don't have to withdraw from the labor force and be penalized by not having any income, that we do have paid leave, paid parental leave, paternity leave, non-transferable quotas, as we know. And also very importantly, that within the social protection system, for example, something like pension benefits, that the way in which pension systems are designed don't penalize people who take time out of their careers for care-related reasons. So within pension systems, we now have these care credits that make sure that people don't get penalized. But also the type of pension system that you have matters a lot. And in the context of pension privatization, for example, it has been very difficult to have these kind of collective financing of pension systems that would allow redistribution within pension systems, and therefore the possibility of having solidarity and supporting those who have to take time out of care system. So the pension design, the type of pension you have, I think matters hugely, and this is an important part of social protection. And if I can just to say, I mean, you said something about, you know, seeing unpaid care and seeing investment in care systems and social protection as an investment and not just an expenditure. I think this is very important, and we have a lot of evidence that shows the way in which social protection, for example, is an investment in people's human capabilities. It's also an automatic and social stabilizer, and we've seen this very clearly through this crisis. Countries that had social protection systems in place were able to come out of the crisis or at least cope with the crisis in a much better way than those that didn't. But I think we also need to turn that question around. I mean, yes, social protection and investment in care systems is an economic issue and provides economic payoffs and social payoffs. But also, let's not forget and let's insist that economic policy, including macroeconomic policy, also always has a social content and huge social implications. So we really have to reopen the question of what constitutes a sound and prudent macroeconomic policy. And I say this particularly because at this point in time, we are all very concerned about what's going to happen in terms of fiscal policies. Are we going to see another round of austerity when it comes to macroeconomic policies that will make all our arguments about investing in care systems, investing in social protection, go to the wayside if the axe is going to come and if austerity is going to be the answer? And I think we have to insist and that there are more than two alternatives. We don't have just a choice between austerity on the one hand and hyperinflation and falling GDP on the other. There are viable alternatives, and this really depends on how societies cope with the financial constraints that they have. And it's important to say that macroeconomic policies that are sound in the sense of balancing the budget, accepting the current balance of financial power, can be very unsound, as Diane Nelson says, in the sense of destroying human capabilities and exacerbating the resource constraints that societies have. As people lose access to employment, as the essential services and goods go into decline, as people face income insecurity and lose hope of a good life for themselves and their children. So I think that's really important, and it means that all countries can and should pursue diverse financing options that are equitable and that can make sure that the investments in their social protection systems and care systems are carried through, and that's really what's going to enable this to be a two-way relationship. Social protection and investments in care services have economic payoffs, but economic policies also have a social content, even if it's sometimes not recognized, and they need to be supporting social policies and social investments. Thank you.
Thank you, Shara. That was fantastic. Thank you. We've had such a good collection of complementary speakers. So now we can go to question and answer. I have a few questions that were already sent in before the talk, and I'm going to start with those while people think of other questions. I think what I'm going to do is to ask, say, 3 questions to start with, and then go around the panelists. You can answer whichever ones you think are particularly relevant to you. So the first question, I think, sort of brings up a lot of the themes that were talked about. But we live in a society that's money driven at the moment. But the division in unpaid work between the men and women is a cultural division. So developing a narrative and changing perspective, this questioner says, requires business cases that challenge both business and social culture. So what would the panel think? Could you provide some insight into business cases that can serve as ways to challenge that divergence between economics and culture? What can businesses do? What sort of business case can you make about that? And make it, I would also add the question to that is, can business do it on its own? I've also got a question, how could we build social security systems that are based on solidarity instead of somebody's paid employment status, that would recognize the reproductive and unpaid care that women do as a contribution to that? And as Shara said, the unpaid care work that women do, or anybody does, is not recognized in our national accounting systems or our model of development. What will it take for care work to be formalized and accounted for? And how would you do it? What would be the mechanism for doing that? So those are my 3 first questions. Sonia, would you like to go first?
Yes, for me, because I'm sorry because I use a language, some of you tell me, Sonia, back to work is not, okay, I apologize, okay? But you have to understand me. I am in the middle of the contradiction, okay? And so my answer to you, at the moment, I'm trying to speak the economical language. So translating care in economic value, okay? Because I fight every day, with this contradiction. Waiting for legislator, policymaker, institution, whatever, GDP change, every day in the company, we have to speak with top management using language. So KPIs, economical measure. And I'm translating the benefit of the care. The care is not waste of time, or is not submerged economy, so something that you have to hide or to do, is crucial, and this is common sense, okay? But you have to translate economically, because a top management has the P&L in the mind, okay? So you have to translate, and my effort, and believe me, at the beginning was really tough, but now the top management see the results of the policy. So they are the ambassador of the policy. But you have to translate care into something, into measurable things. So my KPIs are very useful to reinforce. And the 10 days of paternity, of course, in my view, should become the mother leave, So one day, there is an equal distribution, but it's a journey to go, because I cannot get at the moment the same number of days for fathers. This is not economically sustainable. So I think that this is a journey. I think that we need to change the narrative, communicate the benefit using the language. And sorry, I will try to correct myself now that you point out. But for me, it's really pragmatical. At the end of the day, 100% of my mom are working, they have not to choose between work and family, because this is not freedom for women. Susan, we cannot hear you.
Thank you very much, Sonia. And Olivier, are there questions among the ones that I asked that you'd like to answer?
Thanks very much, Susan. I think the second question was very explicitly addressed by Sonia Malaspina. I do think the question of national accounting and how care work, however unremunerated it is taken into account is one that deserves more consideration. The reason why governments are so focused on increasing the growth of GDP is primarily because they see A, that the growth of GDP means more job opportunities, and B, because they feel that if they increase GDP, they will be able to have more public revenue from taxing economic activity. And I think the proposals made concerning how to value care work should indeed address this question. How can we make sure that the public services, including but not limited to social protection, that allow to support families and indeed to support parental leaves inter alia, how they can be financed if we value better care work. So I think that's an extremely important question. But I do think that the other interveners are probably better positioned, or certainly have more to add to this. Thank you.
Shara,
okay. Yeah, very good. So, yeah, I think, this question about what would it take, I think that was your last question, right? What does it take to really recognize the way in which, in many ways, what we're saying is that these investments in that people make who do unpaid care work, they make investments in other persons. And this is really the foundation on which all economies stand. And yet it's something that can go unrecognized and we can go on taking it for granted. And I think the way in which societies respond when things really get to a crisis point, I think gives us an answer. In some countries in East Asia, and now it's increasing other countries as well, you're having, fertility rates that are so low, below replacement rate, that has sent these countries into a panic. So Republic of Korea is desperately trying to increase parental leave, provide all kinds of incentives in order for couples to have babies, and the patriarchal bargain there has been not very, such that has provided incentives for women to want to have children, because of lack of public response and responsibility in terms of, services and so forth, as well as the sort of domestic bargain that Korean men have struck with women inside the family. So you have, below replacement rate fertility, and, the very famous Australian demographer Peter MacDonald has written about this, the contradictions that you have in systems that are not rewarding, unpaid care work, and how this can send people into societies into this very low replacement rates, fertility. This is one possibility. And the other thing is, when parents are not around and are busy trying to make ends meet, what happens to the kind of investments they can make in their children? And the cost of it is then transferred to schools, to workplaces. So, these are the ways in which I think when unpaid care work is not done, and when there's no time and resources for doing it, the costs that societies have to pay. And it's not something that I think it's fair to say businesses have to do on their own. You do need, I would say, a social insurance system. Businesses' responsibilities is to provide taxes and make social security contributions. And societies and states, specifically governments, have a responsibility to have a collective system that collects finances and distributes benefits in ways that is redistributive and in ways that collects taxes based on what people can afford to pay taxes and based on their income, based on their wealth, and then they benefit from that system. And I think to say it's a private sector responsibility, I think it's not really the way to go. So that would be my answer to your question.
Thank you very much. I'd just like to add something to what Shara's just said, because you pointed out that what's done in a crisis says something very much about an underlying economic system. But it's incredibly inefficient to have to readjust everything you do in a crisis. And so that everything that we've learned about and everything that had to change for a pandemic are just things that should have been there all along. And that would have been much more efficient, even in standard economic terms. And I think that that's a really important message to take from what we've seen about how unpaid care has figured in this crisis. Anna?
Yeah, sure. I guess maybe to just pick up on the question on the private sector and making the business case for businesses to address unpaid care. We have been working for a number of years with Unilever to, through a number of different ways, from building water sources closer to homes to challenging the idea that unpaid care is, women's work in their own advertising of their, soap and dishwashing and laundry brands. And I just wanted to share, some lessons that we've learned around, how to convince the private sector and organize. I'm dropping a link. This is a business briefing, which kind of outlines our learnings from having engaged with the private sector, where we describe, distinct benefits to businesses from addressing unpaid care and the kinds of arguments that have worked. So the first being around talent acquisition and retention, that businesses with policies that support unpaid family and household care, like paid parental leave and flexible work arrangements, actually find it easier to attract and retain workers. Another narrative around, productivity and employee engagement, that employers that take a holistic view of workers' lives, including their caregiving and household responsibilities, and actually help address aspects of that, can improve workforce performance and engagement. And these sorts of, I think, kind of lines of arguments have really helped us to make the case. And I think just reflecting back on our partnership with Unilever, initially marketing managers didn't really believe that men would respond positively to adverts that showed other men doing laundry. However, our social norms research in the UK as well as in low-income countries showed that it did matter, and we were able to change their minds. And as a result, men were motivated to have better relationship, to participate more in care work and have better relationships with partners and children. We've had a very successful campaign in the Philippines called I Love You, which translates into I love you, showing a man sort of reviving romance with his wife through care work as teamwork. And yeah, I'd be happy to share more details on that as well, but thank you.
Thank you very much. Gary, I'm going to ask you another question. You're very welcome to answer any of the questions we've had before, but there is one that's we think is particularly relevant to you. And you've all given such really good full answers to questions, and I'm afraid that's all we have time for. There's one question to come at the end, but of the ones that came from participants. The question, Gary, that somebody sent in ahead of time is that about African tradition that has from the outset defined tasks devolved to women and those specific to men, has a very clear gender division of tasks. And the result of that is that it would be devaluing for men to perform tasks that are not theirs. So how can we change the discourse on the representation of family work in Africa? And what are the elements of answers to be brought in taking into account the particular context? This is framed in terms of Africa, but it is a question that has relevance in other parts of the world too. There are different representations of care work as women's work, but none of them make it very easy for men to participate as well. So Gary, I'd very much like your reflections on this question, as well as any of the others that you'd like to talk about.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up. I mean, one I just will add quickly, and I posted in the chat there a link to a study that we did during COVID with 40 corporations, where 72% of them said that expanding parental leave, and particularly equitable parental leave, so making days available for women and men, help them survive the crisis. So I think, I think we're increasingly seeing a business case for corporations, and I would nudge a little bit, Sonia, to say, I do think corporations making the case that equitable number of days for fathers are actually good for retention for mothers and fathers, and they really do push us along toward equality. There's a couple of corporations, Grupo Boticário in Brazil, that has upped the number of days for fathers to equal what is available in terms of legislation in Brazil for mothers, and it's kind of trying to flip the argument that it's not economically viable for a corporation to do that. Volvo is following, what it's some of the Swedish legislation and making in its plants outside of Sweden, upping the number of days for fathers as well, and nudging toward making those obligatory. So I think, if we do make this normal and part of the workplace, I think we can figure out how it is economically viable and necessary for achieving the equality we all believe in. Susan, to your question on how do we change deeply held norms, I think partly what we do is flip a little bit the myth that men aren't doing some kinds of care work. And I think that's where good qualitative and ethnographic research comes in, of finding where men do certain kinds of care work and what makes that possible. We'll find in many settings men can do it when a partner is ill or during pregnancy, or if it's done collectively with other men in a given village or community. So what do we do to shift some of those norms? And I think the research that Oxfam's done in the Philippines as well, touching on, well, men see it as valuable to care for their wives in terms of the intimate and romantic care. How do we flip that around to say it's also the hands-on care? I think one of our success stories is the one from Rwanda that I mentioned before, which is building on the kind of the importance of the health sector, making it normal for men to be present, and building on the part that you want to be part of a healthy family. And I think in other settings, we've been able to nudge on that as well. So, as we look at the men not doing our share, the UN Women's studies on care work during COVID, between 8 and 15% of women said that their partners were doing equal amounts of care work in the most traditional countries. So 1 in 10 is a pretty low number, but it also says we've got somewhere to start. So I think we've got to be careful that we don't reify that, culture makes these things impossible. Culture also said women shouldn't be heads of state and doing all kinds of things that we're not content, driven by feminist discourse, to say we're going to let culture stand there. So I think similar ways we've got to say, look, there are men who are doing this. Let's hold that up. Let's not focus on the individual who is, I think, maybe Sue, that was you who brought that up before, not just about individual men doing this, but what are the collective changes we need to see to make that possible? So I think stepping away from, culture is insurmountable. It's there, it's real, it shapes norms. But I think to look at the ways that it's transgressed all the time allows us to see that, in fact, there are some men doing the care work, and we can shift those scripts.
Well, thank you very much. I'm afraid we have to finish now. It's a great pity. I was going to ask each of you if you had one key message, and if anybody is bursting to give us a key message, please do. Just shout out.
I start. For me,
yeah.
The hashtag is
just half a minute.
Yeah, there is no future is an hashtag. There is no future without care.
Good. Okay, thank you. Anyone else? It's an impossible question. So what I'd just like to say is thank you all very, very much. This has been a fantastic event, wonderful speeches, very good extended responses to questions, and this is an organization that we have to keep supporting. It's really important to make mothers matter. So thank you all very much.
Thank you very much to all of you. And our task now is to bring about the change. And please, let's keep in touch and work on that, each where we are and doing what we're doing. But thank you to all our panelists and to all our participants, because our participants are key. They are really instrumental to bring about that change. Everybody is important. Thank you to our interpreters, because their generosity and their competencies made this webinar available to French-speaking people, and that was a real asset. Thank you to our wonderful moderators, Susan. It was nice to have you involved in that way, to be able to gather everybody's speech and experience. And thank you to each panelist. And also to the MMM teams working behind the scene, all of you there making this webinar lively, and you will find all the information also on our website. And once again, let's keep in touch to make the change happen. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.